Some people think success gives you more freedom, but sometimes it gives you less patience, less tolerance, less room for noise, and eventually less access to you, because the higher you climb in any arena where decisions shape the future, the more dangerous wasted energy becomes. There's a quiet shift that happens to certain people once they cross a particular threshold of responsibility. At first, they try to stay the same person they've always been: available, responsive, open to everyone. But slowly, almost reluctantly, they realize something uncomfortable. Not everyone deserves the same access to their attention. And that realization comes with a cost, because the world rarely celebrates boundaries. When they appear suddenly, it questions them. It criticizes them, sometimes it even resents them. And if you've ever been the person in the room who sees the bigger picture before everyone else, you already know the tension that creates. Some of you listening know exactly what that feels like. You start noticing something subtle but unsettling. Energy is not just time, energy is decision-making power. It's emotional bandwidth, mental clarity, creative oxygen. And the moment your energy becomes valuable to the outcome of things larger than yourself, people start pulling on it from every direction. That realization doesn't arrive dramatically. It creeps in, usually during an ordinary moment, like a late evening meeting that runs longer than it should. Picture a glass conference room overlooking a dark city skyline. It's past 10:30 at night. The building is almost empty. The cleaning staff is moving quietly down the hallway with carts that squeak softly against the tile. Inside the room, a group of executives are still talking: slides, charts, projections, voices overlapping. Everyone has opinions, but one person in the room has been unusually quiet, not because they don't have thoughts, because they're calculating something deeper. They're watching the room, watching the dynamics, watching how many words are being used to say almost nothing. And in that moment, something clicks. Not frustration, clarity. The realization that most conversations aren't actually about progress. They're about comfort, about making people feel involved, about preserving social balance. But progress doesn't care about comfort. And when someone starts carrying decisions that affect thousands of employees, or industries, or technology itself, the tolerance for unnecessary conversation starts shrinking fast. That night, when the meeting finally ends, the hallway outside is silent. The city lights flicker through the glass walls. One of the executives walks beside him toward the elevator and laughs lightly. Long day, a polite smile, a small nod, but internally, something else is happening. A quiet inventory. How much energy did today cost? How much of it moved things forward? And how much of it was just noise disguised as collaboration? Because the truth is something very few people talk about. The more ambitious the vision becomes, the more ruthless someone must become with their attention. Not with people, with access. And that distinction is where the misunderstanding begins. From the outside, it looks like someone becoming distant, harder to reach, less social. Less patient with small talk. But internally, it feels very different. It feels like survival. There's a moment, and almost every highly driven builder experiences it, when they realize that saying yes to everyone is actually saying no to the work that matters most. And that moment is uncomfortable, because humans are wired to maintain harmony. We want to be liked, we want to be approachable. We want to be the person people feel good around, but vision doesn't always reward that instinct. Sometimes vision demands something colder: selective attention, selective conversation, selective access. And when that shift begins, relationships start changing. Some people understand immediately, others take it personally, and a few become quietly resentful. There was another moment months later that revealed this tension even more clearly. A private dinner. Small group, a long wooden table inside a quiet restaurant where the lighting is low and the conversations are supposed to be relaxed. One of those evenings where everyone is technically successful, everyone has interesting stories, but not everyone is thinking at the same altitude. Halfway through the meal, someone leans forward and asks a casual question: so why are you so hard to get a hold of lately? The tone is playful, but underneath it, there's an edge. The table gets quiet for a second, Because the question isn't really about phone calls. It's about status. About perceived distance, about access. And in moments like that, a person has two options. They can apologize or they can tell the truth. But the truth is rarely comfortable, because the honest answer would sound something like this. When the scale of your problems changes, your tolerance for distraction changes with it. Not because you think you're better than anyone, because the consequences of wasted attention become enormous. But explaining that out loud feels almost impossible without sounding arrogant. So instead, people simplify. They say things like, just been busy, and everyone nods politely. But internally, something deeper is unfolding, a psychological shift that many ambitious people go through, but few admit publicly. You start protecting your energy like a finite resource because it is. And the world doesn't always respond kindly when someone becomes selective about where their presence goes. If you've ever felt that quiet pressure, the expectation to always be available, always agreeable, always reachable, you know how complicated that tension becomes, especially when your vision starts pulling you somewhere most people around you can't fully see yet. And the real question begins forming somewhere beneath the surface, not out loud. Not yet, but quietly, persistently. What happens when protecting your energy starts changing how people see you? And more importantly, what happens when you realize that becoming more selective might be the only way to build something truly meaningful? That's where the real story begins. The first time someone realizes you've changed, it usually isn't you who notices. It's them. A pause in a conversation, comment that lingers a little longer than it should, a subtle shift in how people describe you when you're not in the room. And suddenly the same focus that once impressed people starts making them uncomfortable, because intensity is inspiring from a distance. Up close, it can feel intimidating. And that's the strange paradox of ambitious vision. The more serious someone becomes about protecting their energy, the more people start questioning their intentions. But the truth is rarely as dramatic as the outside world imagines. Most of the time, it begins with exhaustion. Not physical exhaustion, decision exhaustion. Every day becomes a series of forks in the road. Do we build this or that? Do we wait or move now? Do we compromise or double down? Hundreds of decisions every single day. And slowly, quietly, something inside begins to recalibrate. You start noticing how much of your mental space is being occupied by things that don't move the mission forward. Endless explanations, reassuring conversations, meetings designed more for alignment than action. None of these things are malicious, but they accumulate. And one afternoon, in the middle of a completely ordinary moment, the realization becomes unavoidable. It was early afternoon. A grey sky hung over the industrial buildings outside a factory complex. The kind of sky that flattens the horizon and makes everything feel heavier than usual inside the building. The air smelled faintly of metal and warm circuitry. Production lines moved steadily. Robotic arms pivoted and lowered with mechanical precision. A small group of engineers stood around a prototype unit, discussing a flaw that had delayed testing for nearly 2 weeks. The conversation had been going in circles for almost an hour. Everyone had good ideas. Everyone had careful reasoning, but nothing was moving. And then, finally, the silence broke. A direct question: what's actually stopping us from testing it today? The group exchanged looks. One engineer mentioned safety margins. Another talked about protocol. Third referenced how the board might react if something failed publicly. All valid concerns, but something about the moment revealed a deeper pattern. Fear disguised as thoroughness. Caution disguised as professionalism. And suddenly the realization sharpened. Progress dies in rooms where everyone is trying to protect their reputation. That thought didn't come with anger. It came with clarity, and clarity changes behavior. After that day, something subtle shifted in how conversations were approached. Meetings got shorter, questions became sharper, and more importantly, fewer people were invited into the room, not as punishment, as necessity, because every additional voice carries weight, every additional perspective introduces friction, and when the pace of the mission accelerates, friction becomes expensive. But here's the part people rarely understand from the outside: becoming selective with energy doesn't feel powerful. It feels lonely. Because access isn't just a logistical decision. It's a social one. When someone reduces the number of conversations they participate in, people notice. When someone stops attending events they used to attend, people notice. When someone starts choosing silence instead of explaining every decision, people definitely notice. And slowly, the interpretations begin. He's becoming difficult. He's too intense lately. He doesn't care about relationships anymore. But those interpretations miss something important. Energy isn't just about time. It's about mental clarity, and clarity is fragile. One unnecessary argument, one draining conversation, one meeting that goes nowhere for 2 hours, and suddenly the entire afternoon disappears. Some of you listening know exactly what this feels like. You're not avoiding people, you're protecting the one thing that allows you to build anything meaningful at all. Your attention. But protecting attention has consequences, because humans interpret absence emotionally. There was a moment during a strategy session months later that revealed just how deep that misunderstanding could go. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the overhead lights, a long table, wall of screens showing technical projections, and a handful of senior team members discussing a launch timeline that felt aggressive. Too aggressive for some. One of them finally leaned back in his chair and spoke carefully. You know, people are starting to say you're harder to work with lately. No accusation. Just observation. But the statement hung in the air because everyone in the room knew what it really meant. You're pushing too hard. You're moving too fast. You're not explaining enough. And for a brief moment, the silence stretched longer than usual. Not out of defensiveness, out of calculation. Because in leadership moments like that, honesty can change the trajectory of the entire room. Finally, the response came. Calm and direct. I'm not trying to be difficult. A pause. I'm trying to remove everything that slows us down. No anger. No drama. Just a statement of intent. And yet, even that answer carries a hidden cost, because when someone prioritizes momentum over comfort, not everyone will follow. Some people admire it, some people tolerate it. And some people quietly step away. That's the part the public never sees when they look at high-profile builders. They see bold decisions, they see massive projects. They see ambitious timelines, but they rarely see the internal tension that grows behind those decisions, the tension between connection and focus. Between accessibility and execution. Between being understood and getting the work done. And the higher the stakes rise, the more painful that tension becomes. Because eventually you reach a point where you have to ask yourself something most people avoid. What matters more, being liked or finishing what you started? It sounds simple when phrased like that. But in real life, it never is, because every decision to narrow your focus also narrows your social circle. Every decision to protect your attention creates distance somewhere. And the question that begins quietly forming in the background becomes harder to ignore. How much isolation is the price of building something that changes the world? Some of you listening already know the answer to that question. You felt it the moment when you realize the path you're on requires a level of selectiveness that other people might never fully understand. But what most people don't realize is that the real shift hasn't even happened yet, because becoming selective with your energy is only the first step. The deeper transformation comes later, when you start deciding not just who gets your attention, but what kind of person you're willing to become in order to protect it. And that's where things start getting complicated. Asterisk. There's a moment in every ambitious life when selectiveness stops being a strategy and starts becoming a personality. Not intentionally, not dramatically, just gradually. At first, you only filter your time, then you filter conversations, then opportunities, and eventually people. Not because you dislike them, because your mind has become a battlefield of priorities, and every unnecessary interaction feels like a tiny leak in a system that's already under pressure. But here's the uncomfortable truth most people never say out loud. When you become extremely protective of your energy, you risk becoming someone harder to recognize, even to yourself, and that's where the real psychological tension begins. Because ambition isn't just about building things. It slowly reshapes the builder. There was a night late, quiet, and strangely still, when that realization surfaced in a way that couldn't be ignored. It was close to midnight. The office building had mostly emptied hours earlier. Only a few scattered lights were still on across the floor. The kind of silence that exists only when a place designed for hundreds of people suddenly holds only one or two outside the tall windows. The parking lot was dark except for a few distant street lights. Inside the office, a laptop screen cast a cold blue glow across. Stacks of printed design schematics spread across the desk. Prototype notes, engineering diagrams, a half-finished email draft. But the work had paused, not because there wasn't more to do. Because something unexpected had crept into the room. Fatigue of a different kind, the kind that isn't solved with sleep. The chair leaned back slightly. And for the first time that day, there was silence long enough for reflection to slip in. A question surfaced. Not about rockets. Not about technology. About identity. When did everything start feeling so filtered? That thought lingered longer than expected, because the change had been gradual. A few years earlier, conversations were easier. There was more tolerance for wandering discussions, more patience for social rituals, more willingness to explain every idea in detail. But now, the mind moved faster than most conversations could keep up with. And explaining things repeatedly began to feel exhausting. Not because people weren't intelligent, but because the mission had accelerated beyond normal pacing. The future doesn't move politely, and that creates a strange psychological distance. You begin living mentally 5 or 10 steps ahead of the present moment. Meanwhile, everyone around you is still standing on step 1, asking questions about step 2. That gap creates friction, not hostility, just distance, and distance, over time, can start looking like indifference. Some of you listening know exactly what this feels like. You're not trying to be cold, you're just operating on a timeline most people around you haven't seen yet. But here's the part that makes it complicated. The more someone protects their attention, the fewer mirrors they have around them, fewer casual conversations, fewer spontaneous perspectives, fewer people willing to challenge them openly. And slowly, without noticing, a different kind of risk appears. Isolation. Not physical isolation, psychological isolation. Because the higher someone climbs in responsibility, the harder it becomes to know who is being honest with them and who is simply adapting to their influence. That's a dangerous environment for any human mind, even a brilliant one. There was a moment months later that made this reality painfully clear. It happened during a small internal presentation. A young engineer, maybe mid-20s, was walking through a proposal for improving efficiency on a manufacturing process. He was nervous. His voice wavered slightly at first, but the idea itself was solid. Practical. Creative. Exactly the kind of thinking that moves things forward. Halfway through the explanation, he paused and said something unexpected. "I almost didn't bring this up." The room went quiet. Someone asked why, hesitated. Then answered, "Honestly, people say you don't like hearing problems unless they're already solved." Not confrontational, just nervous honesty. But the statement landed harder than anyone expected. Because it revealed something uncomfortable. When someone becomes intensely focused on efficiency and results, the people around them can start editing themselves, filtering their thoughts, avoiding risk. Not because they're told to, because they assume that's what's expected. And that realization carries weight. Because innovation requires the opposite. It requires people who feel safe presenting imperfect ideas, incomplete solutions. Messy thinking. For a moment, the room stayed silent. Not tense. Reflective. And in that silence, something important surfaced. Becoming selective with energy is necessary, but if it goes too far, it can quietly suffocate the very creativity you depend on. That's the hidden edge of intense focus. It sharpens progress, but it can also narrow perspective. And once you notice that dynamic, a new question begins forming, one far more complicated than the first. How do you protect your energy without building invisible walls around yourself? Because the truth is, extreme selectiveness solves one problem but creates another. Efficiency improves, momentum increases, but the human ecosystem around you starts adapting in unpredictable ways. People become cautious. Careful. Less spontaneous. And for someone trying to build the future, that environment can slowly become dangerous. Not immediately. Gradually. Like They're leaving a room so slowly no one notices until breathing becomes difficult. If you've ever been the person carrying a vision that moves faster than the environment around you, you've probably felt that tension to the balance between clarity and openness, between protection and connection, between focus and humanity. And here's the uncomfortable part. No one teaches you how to navigate that balance. There's no handbook for it. Every decision becomes a personal experiment. Sometimes you pull back too far. Sometimes you open the door too wide again. But over time, something deeper starts forming, a new understanding of energy. Not just protecting it, directing it. And once that realization begins taking shape, the way you interact with the world changes again. Because the real mastery isn't simply deciding who gets access to your attention. The real mastery is learning when to open the door again, without losing the clarity that made the mission possible in the first place. And that final shift is the one very few people ever see coming. Asterisk. There's a point where protecting your energy stops being about defense and starts becoming about precision, not shutting people out, not withdrawing from the world. But learning exactly where your presence creates the most impact. Because the truth most ambitious people eventually discover is this: you cannot give equal energy to everything without destroying the one thing that matters most. Focus is expensive, but diffusion is fatal, and the deeper someone moves into building something meaningful, the clearer that trade-off becomes. By the time that realization fully settles in, the world around them has already started adjusting. People have formed opinions. Stories. Interpretations. Some think the distance means ego, some think it means obsession, some think it means detachment. But the reality is usually much quieter than that. It's single quotes as simply math. Energy in, progress out. And once you start seeing life through that lens, every conversation begins to carry a different weight. Not in a cynical way, in a deliberate way. There was a moment not long after that difficult presentation with the young engineer when this new understanding became visible in a completely different setting. Early morning. Just after sunrise, the sky outside the testing facility was pale orange, the kind of light that makes everything look slightly unfinished. The parking lot was still mostly empty. Inside the building, the atmosphere felt different from the usual rush of the day. Fewer voices, slower movement. Coffee machines humming in the background. On the factory floor, a small group of engineers were gathered around a newly assembled prototype. No big meeting. No official presentation. Just quiet curiosity. One of the engineers looked up and seemed slightly surprised to see someone walk in that early. But instead of rushing past or staying distant, the response was simple, a question. "What are you working on?" The engineer hesitated for a second, then started explaining the design. Not perfectly. Not with polished slides or prepared talking points, just raw thinking, and something interesting happened in that moment. The conversation didn't rush. There was no pressure to perform. Just curiosity, clarifying questions, small adjustments to the idea. By the end of the discussion, the prototype had already improved, not because of authority, because of presence. And that's when the final piece of the puzzle began to make sense. Selectiveness with energy isn't about less interaction. It's about better interaction. Fewer rooms, but the right rooms. Fewer conversations, but deeper ones. Fewer opinions, but sharper thinking. The mistake many people make when they observe highly focused individuals is assuming they're withdrawing from people. But what's actually happening is more nuanced. They're withdrawing from noise, not from humans, from distraction, from conversations that move in circles, from expectations that exist purely to maintain social comfort. And when those layers fall away, something interesting appears underneath. Real collaboration. Real progress, real creativity. But reaching that balance takes time, because along the way, mistakes happen. Sometimes you close the door too early. Sometimes you push people away who might have helped. Sometimes the intensity becomes sharper than intended. That's the hidden cost of protecting your energy. You're constantly adjusting, constantly recalibrating, constantly asking yourself, is this boundary helping the mission or protecting my ego? And the honest answer isn't always easy, because the line between clarity and arrogance can become dangerously thin. Some of you listening have probably wrestled with that exact tension. You start setting boundaries because you need focus. But then you notice how quickly people interpret those boundaries, distance, coldness, indifference, and suddenly you're carrying a strange internal conflict. You want connection, but you also need space to build. You want collaboration, but you can't allow endless debate. You want people around you, but not everyone can move at the same speed. That's a lonely equation, and it's one many builders quietly live with. But here's the surprising truth most people miss when they look at figures known for relentless focus. The goal isn't isolation, it's alignment. The real evolution happens when someone stops trying to manage everyone's expectations and starts investing deeply in the few people who truly understand the mission. The ones who challenge ideas without slowing momentum. The ones who bring solutions instead of noise. The ones who aren't intimidated by intensity. Because they share it. When those people appear, everything changes. The rooms get smaller, but the thinking gets bigger. The conversations get shorter, but the outcomes become more powerful. And the energy that once felt constantly drained starts multiplying instead, because energy shared with the right minds doesn't shrink, it compounds. That's the final transformation behind becoming selective with your attention. It's not about becoming unreachable, it's about becoming intentional. And if you've ever felt misunderstood because you guard your time, if you've ever been called distant when you were simply trying to stay focused, if you've ever noticed yourself quietly stepping away from conversations that lead nowhere, you're not alone in that experience. You're experiencing the same shift that happens to anyone who starts taking their purpose seriously. And here's the question worth reflecting on tonight. Not about ambition, not about success, about energy. Where is your attention actually going? Who truly moves your thinking forward? And which conversations leave you feeling clearer instead of heavier? Some of you already know the answers. You've felt them for a long time. Maybe this is simply the moment you start trusting that instinct a little more, because protecting your energy isn't selfish when done with clarity. It's responsibility, especially if you're trying to build something that lasts longer than a single moment of approval. And if this perspective resonates with you, if you're someone who values depth, focus, and meaningful conversations over noise, then you're exactly the kind of person this space was created for. So I'm curious about something. Have you ever had to become more selective with your energy and noticed people around you reacting to that change? Some of you probably have stories about that moment. The moment when protecting your focus started changing how others saw you. Share it in the comments. Because those experiences say more about the path you're walking than most people realize. And if these kinds of reflections speak to the part of you that thinks deeply about life, purpose, and human psychology, then stay connected. There are many more conversations like this waiting ahead.